Hello and welcome to our session, which is the Lorax Revisited, Protecting Forest from Illegal Logging and Deforestation. Global deforestation has been increasing over the years, is a major global problem which affects climate change, affects biodiversity, and it is driven by a range of human activities. And it is so important to focus on one of the key issues affecting our global forest, which is illegal logging. Illegal logging happens throughout the world, all the different continents, illegal logging, which is really a big business, that there are billions of dollars associated with it. And it affects not only the forests, but also the people who live in the forest and around the forest. And there is incredible activity, especially by criminal groups, mafias, which are involved in extracting timber and threaten the lives of those people who protect the forest and also, unfortunately, kill those people. So today in this panel with me, Luca Tacconi from the Crawford School at the Australian National University, we have four panelists who will bring their experience from their long-term work in this sector. And the panelists will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we have a debate. I will introduce them in a moment. Now, before I do that, I would like to remind the audience that at the end of this session, you can join the discussion in a separate room, which is called the Continuing the Discussion Room, essentially, where you will be able to ask questions and discuss with the panelists. Now, so let me introduce our panelists today, and I will introduce them in order in which they will speak first. We have Francisco Souza, who's Managing Director of the Forest Stewardship Council's Indigenous Foundation. We'll have then Julia Urunaga, who is the Director for the Peru Program of the Environmental Investigation Agency. We will have then Daniel Wilkinson, who is Director for Environment and Human Rights at Human Rights Watch. And finally, we'll hear from Carol Excel, who's the Director of Environmental Democracy Practice with the World Resources Institute. So I would like to welcome first Francisco Souza to please give your remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. By start the discussion, I have an opportunity here to bring the eyes of who are inside the forest. That's my intention here. So if I invite you to go to my community in the Amazon jungle to talk about illegal logging, deforestation, my brothers and sisters there, they will perhaps talk with you about 3 indigenous perspectives. The first perspective they are going to show you about the importance of seeing forest as life. They're going to talk to you about culture, traditional practices, community equality service group they provide, they connect to the local market, they support their community members. They are also talk about in second perspectives, how they struggle to govern their forest with increasing threats. They are going to talk about mining, cattle, infrastructure, deforestation, violence, and also about conflict. The third perspective they are going to share with you is how they see the importance of managing forests through sustainable and holistic practices. They are going to share with you their perspective in terms of the indigenous resource management. They are going to show to you the importance of considering agroforestry, the importance of protecting rivers, the wildlife, biodiversity, the other ecosystem. I want to connect my contribution to this panel to these 3 different perspectives. On the first perspective, I prefer to think more in terms of the social culture principle, which is quite important to underline the motivation for promoting enforce indigenous rights. The second perspective is more in terms of the institutional and economic principle that we can bring the critical challenge faced by forest and indigenous people nowadays. It's about the challenge of having market nowadays that not incorporate the value of natural capital. It's about the challenge of creating mechanisms to internalize the negative environmental externality, but it also about the challenge of have public policy in national framework, non-connected to indigenous rights, non-connected to promote enforce responsible business. It's also about the potential gaps of this existing sustainable economic instruments. The third perspective is more a multidimensional principle that we can have as an opportunity to value sustainable forest, natural-based solution as a way to face deforestation and also illegal logging. It's also about the opportunity to influence market, political, and forest governance system toward more sustainable in a more responsible economic development. But it also is an opportunity to incorporate traditional knowledge and practice into business, policy, and inclusive development. So I'm going to talk to you about these three different principles. On the first principle is about the cultural and in social aspect, is about the importance of seeing the future of the forest depends very much on the futures of the indigenous people. We are almost 400 million indigenous people, manage 1/4 of the planet. In your territory, you can find 80% of the world biodiversity, 40% of the remaining global native forest. We can see our territory also as a stock for carbon, water, climate regulation, different other opportunity in terms of the ecosystem service. The point here is the fact that there is no solution to protect the forest with those solutions to protect the indigenous people. Here also, we can talk about the importance of the indigenous people in terms of the opportunity to provide global solution to ongoing challenges, for instance, in terms of the climate change, food security, poverty, and inclusive development. The second principle that I want to talk to you about the institutional economic aspect is the fact that the business, the policy with business as usual practice fails to incorporate the value of forest indigenous people. There is no incentive. There is an incentive actually to illegal logging and deforestation. That incentive actually the violation against the indigenous people rights, and also the violation creating barrier against sustainable forest use. There is also a weak or gap of enforcement of existing law, a weak environmental safeguard measure to protect forests and the people, and also the pull pressure from demand side in the market to encourage sustainable practice. The outcome from this combination would be the natural capital externality, environmental externality are not incorporated into business and public decision making. If you think in terms of the potential way to mitigate that, we can think in terms of the FPIC, we can think about the ILO 169, we can think in terms of the UN Declaration on Indigenous People Rights, the other instruments that are very important, but they must be connected and support by economic instrument to the new political illegal framework at national and indigenous level. Now let's to think in terms of how would be the way to transform or to face deforestation, illegal logging. So the way that we can think is about transforming forest governance through economic, social, environmental principle is standards. That is more connected to my previous comment related to the multi-dimension aspect. Think about the solution.
Francisco, sorry to interrupt, just if you can wrap up in about 1 minute.
Okay, good. So think about the solution is think about the sustainable way that we can manage the forest. And as FSC, for instance, we do have 200 million of certified forests in almost 100 countries. We include the indigenous people to be part of our governance. We include the different sectors to discuss about. But we still have some challenge. We need to create a sustainable solution to connect the private sectors to include the public sectors to emphasize or to enforce the existing mechanism and to create a more effective way to catalyze systematic change in the long term. That's the key element that I think we can think in terms of the solution. And thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco. And I'm really looking forward to coming back and having discussion around the major issues that you raised there. Could I please now invite Julia Urunaga, please, to give your initial remarks?
Thank you, Luca, and thank you everybody for attending this session. So I want to talk about a concept that an idea that I think it's the most important one for me, and it's that illegal logging kills. And as Francisco was saying, this is key. I mean, the forest cannot survive without the people who live in the forest, and illegal activities and everybody who is part of that is actually creating this problem. So if there's one thing I would like you to take away from what I'm going to say today is that illegal logging kills, and that an important part here is corruption, right? So I'm gonna come back to that in a moment, but I wanted to mention that just in Peru, for example, my country, during the pandemic, at least 7 environmental defenders have been assassinated by mafias that are illegal logging mafias or land grabbing. So have to do mainly with either directly illegal logging or land use change, the illegal deforestation. And many of our partners and many of our friends from indigenous communities and indigenous organizations receive death threats all the time, and it's a very difficult way to live, as you can imagine. So another important thing to consider is how you are part of this, and the key thing here is that illegal logging requires buyers, right? If there are no buyers, if there are no markets for illegal timber, then there's no economic incentive for the crime. So that's another concept to keep in mind. And the next one, which is very important also, is the concept of timber laundering, right? Because how is it possible that there's so much illegal timber, not only in the producer countries' markets, but also in international markets? And that's because illegal timber gets laundered and camouflaged and pretends to be legal to arrive to your countries and to arrive to your living room as a diner table or a desk. So it's very important to understand that if we're going to fight illegal logging, if we're going to help indigenous communities to protect their forests, we need to work on transparency. It's key that buyers and the industry and the suppliers of timber actually can provide effective and verifiable traceability for the legal origin of their products. And here comes back, we come back to the concept of corruption, because timber laundering implies, requires a combination of private and public corruption. You have, on one hand, the concessionaires, the timber concessionaires that make fake forest inventories or pretend that they're harvesting the timber from an authorized place. And then on the other hand, you need the public authority that is going to validate that fake information, knowing that it's not true. once the timber has been laundered and it has papers that pretend to be legal, it's harder to find the origin, but it's possible. I mean, I'm an investigative journalist. That's my first career, and I have dedicated the last 10, 12 years of my life to just document and find and prove that it's possible to find and differentiate legal timber from illegal timber. Whoever wants to learn more about this, I'm very happy to talk in more detail. There's plenty of information. It's just that in many places, the industry pretends that that's not possible as a way to camouflage the illegal timber with the legal one and get access to international markets. So some of the things that we have been working on and that we have seen also that have start having impact in order to deal with this problem is demand side policies, right? And since we're talking to an audience of lawyers, maybe you will be interested in this. Laws like the Lacey Act for the United States or the European Timber Regulation for Europe are becoming important. They're not enough, but they're helping, right? For example, in the case of Peru, applying the Lacey Act a couple of years ago, 24 pallets of illegal timber that had arrived had been stolen from the Peruvian Amazon and were coming to Houston were destroyed, right? So having this implementation of the law and demanding the industry to be more responsible about what they buy and what they trade is actually helping, because now we see that the exporters in Peru are complaining and saying, oh, but they don't want to buy our timber because they think that it might be illegal. It's not about trying to make the industry disappear. We want the industry, but we want good industry. And the best way to help those guys who are trying to do the right thing is to make sure that there's no room for illegality. So that's an important international policy option that we have been seeing in the last few years. Also, trade agreements. I mean, the United States and Peru have a very unique kind of trade agreement that has a forest annex that has a number of requirements that are mandatory, legally binding, about standards that both countries need to implement in terms of making sure that the trade is legal, that there are no human rights abuses. And
sorry to come in, Julia.
Yeah.
Just 1 minute, and if you could wrap up, yes.
Perfect. Yes. So because of the trade agreement, also with the United States, already 2 Peruvian companies that had a large history of exporting illegal timber have already been banned from the United States markets. So that is starting to send a message. And there are other threats, of course, to the forest indigenous rights and to the forest and the indigenous rights. And there are more like illegal land use change of the Amazon for commodities such as palm oil or soy or meat that also need to be observed because have the same devastating impact on the forest and on indigenous rights. And we can talk more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. One thing that you mentioned is that you have been working in this area for many years. This is my experience as well. I've been working on illegal logging for a couple of decades. So one thing I would like to come back when we have a debate, I can say now, is we've got so many experience in the past couple of decades, and it's something I might ask you, and also from what Francisco was talking about, is what can we do different going forward from the past couple of decades? So thank you very much for your comments. And I would now like to invite Daniel Wilkinson. Daniel, over to you, please.
Okay, great. Thank you, Luca. Thank you, everyone else. So I don't have decades of experience working on the issues of forest preservation, but I do have decades of experience working on human rights at Human Rights Watch. And I thought I'd use my time to discuss what we've been reporting on specifically in the context of the Brazilian Amazon and the crisis there. that touches on the themes that Julia and Francisco have raised, share with that. The basic message here and what we've been reporting on and showing is that this environmental crisis that is very well known and well documented globally in the Amazon is also very much a human rights crisis. And it's a human rights crisis in terms of impacts on the rights of the general population in Brazil, and also specifically on the rights of the Brazilians who are trying to protect the rainforest. In terms of the general population, we produced a report last year with two Brazilian think tanks that looked at what happens with the forest fires that are set every year as sort of the culminating the process of clearing the land after trees have been taken down. And what we found is the pollution produced by those fires every year was poisoning the air that millions of people were breathing. We looked at 2019 and found that just in the month of August, more than 4.5 million Brazilians were breathing air that exceeded what the WHO says is safe to breathe, right, for lengthy periods of time. We found more than 2,000 people hospitalized because of the air they were breathing, 500 children. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. These are the people who actually get to the hospitals. Many people who are breathing this air have respiratory problems, are living in places where they're not going to the hospitals. They're suffering at home. That has enormous consequences. The area I want to focus on, though, is the rights of the defenders of the forest. And here to underscore or reiterate what Julia said about illegal logging kills and the situation Francisco's described in his community is the dynamic on the ground is very difficult. There is violence, there's intimidation, and basically in the context of the Brazilian Amazon, the destruction is being driven largely by mafias, as Julia said, criminal networks, right, that have the capacity to actually open roads into the forest, to cut down the trees, to bring them out, to corrupt officials, to certify things, to send it to the market. That's big business and is criminal enterprises. And a part of that enterprise is having people on the payroll or bought who are gunmen who engage in violence and go after the people who are trying to uphold the law and stop these illegal practices. This includes environmental enforcement agents who themselves are at risk, and local members of communities, in particular indigenous communities. So this is a big problem throughout the Amazon. And here the issue of environment policy and human rights and the violence are very much intertwined. Because what you see in Brazil, which was a country that a decade ago was a global leader in forest preservation, where laws are put in place, good laws, institutions are in place. And like anywhere where there's effective law enforcement, there is cooperation with local communities that provide information that help signal where there's illegal activity. What happened is when you have, starting around 2012, the enforcement agencies were weakened. And the more they were weakened, the personnel was reduced, the budgets were cut, and their capacity to monitor what was going on or follow up on what they saw from satellites was greatly reduced. And what happened there was that, on the one hand, it emboldened these mafias to pursue their criminal enterprises. And on the other, it put more pressure on local residents to do the work that the state is supposed to be doing in terms of enforcing the law. This is most dramatic in many indigenous communities. Our reporting looked particularly in the state of Maranhão, but in other states we see this as well, where communities felt they had to actually organize and create units to patrol. They call them forest guardians, to actually go out and do what the state should be doing, to see where there's illegal logging and make sure there are actions. They took on this responsibility themselves, but it's also putting themselves in harm's way. So as you weaken the state enforcement and environmental laws, you create a situation that becomes increasingly more dangerous for communities who face these emboldened mafias and have to basically try to stop them. And that results in violence. Now, this is a problem that existed before the current government of Jair Bolsonaro came in. It was already a very big problem, but it's so much worse when you have a president and an administration that is so, has policies that are so vehemently, almost virulently anti-environmental as they have, that have taken already weakened institutions and sought to sabotage them.
Sorry, Daniel, to come in just one more minute, please.
Okay, so the situation now in the Amazon is one where there is weakened institutions and basically a lack of enforcement. The fundamental issue here to stress is accountability and impunity. The problem is that the acts of violence and intimidation are rarely investigated. The people who commit these crimes are not brought to justice. And the same thing with the environmental laws as well. Now, what do you do in a situation like Brazil, where you have a government that does not care what civil society groups have to say, environmental groups have to say, indigenous communities have to say? It's very hard to exercise any sort of pressure. And the best we felt with our partners or Brazilian organizations, our Brazilian staff, is we really needed to go to the international community. So there's been a lot of advocacy that's been done by people concerned about the Amazon elsewhere to figuring out what is it that a government like this cares about. And one thing it cares about is its international reputation and economic opportunities presented by trade agreements and so on. So that's where right now the hope is, largely to get a government like this to at least put the brakes on its worst policies. But here the challenge is that, governments like the Bolsonaro government can begin to admit there's a problem, create a national Amazon Council to address it, announce all sorts of policies. But until you deal with it, this fundamental problem of impunity and accountability, the mafias still feel they effectively have a green light, and they'll continue to deforest, and that's why the situation is only getting worse. So I'll stop there, and we can pick it up in the discussion.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I look forward to actually discuss some of the points you raised at the end. What can we do next, essentially? Now, last but not least, obviously, Carol Excel, please, over to you.
Thanks very much, Luca, and thank you to all the other panelists as well. I'm going to try and build on what Julia, Daniel, and Francisco said, which I think really provided a great context to some of the big issues around illegal logging found in different countries and the range of approaches that need to be taken to address it. And I've loved that each panelist has reflected the importance of the people who live in the forest. And I'm going to build on that, actually going back to Peru, which I think tells us a really important story of both what is possible and why this issue persists. I want to talk a little bit about the case of Edwin Chota, who was murdered alongside Jorge Rios, Leontio Quintisima, and Francisco Pinedo in 2014. There were 4 indigenous activists who had battled illegal logging in the Amazon jungle in Peru for years, and many civil society organizations, both nationally and internationally, including EIA, are very supportive of this case. And one of the few that I could say, and it's often seen as one of an unprecedented case, one of the few for which prosecutors actually have acted and charged executives and loggers for the murder of these indigenous activists. I think the case is really important because it tells us what a huge leap and hurdle it is to get justice for indigenous defenders who are battling illegal logging. And it's also an area of law reform that we really need to see more emphasis on, in looking how to ensure that those who do seek to stop illegal logging and who are attacked, environmental and land defenders, indigenous activists, that the impunity doesn't continue. And it's an aspect of, immediately when you think of how do we deal with illegal logging, you don't necessarily think about judicial reform for prosecuting those who kill defenders. But I think it's such a important component of the reform that is needed, and the emphasis that needs to be placed on ensuring that those who are defending the forest are at the forefront of your mind. How do we prevent attacks and threats? Must be one way that we address the issue of illegal logging, not just at the end, the buying or the selling, but how do we prevent those who are actually in the forest for getting attacked for defending it, and how do we ensure that their rights are respected? So that that there's real clarity around how they can manage those forests. And that goes back to Francisco's comments. So his case, I'm sure everybody on the panel knows it, but it was carried globally by the press. It was a case that took, I believe, 5 years before anyone was prosecuted. And even so, it took both his community, all the indigenous peoples, and his daughter working for so many years to try and get the prosecutors to take up the case. After many years of kind of ineffectual or no response by the government to seek to prosecute the loggers and those in the timber industry who were found to be responsible. The activists who were killed, these indigenous people, had been at the forefront of looking at how do you manage your land, presenting photos and sketches of illegal activities, reporting it to government, reporting it to enforcement agencies, doing all that you would expect in the indigenous peoples within their territory to do, and yet still they were murdered for the work that they were doing to try and protect the forests. Their bodies, two of the bodies of the indigenous leaders were not even found. And while this arrest is unprecedented, it really tells us a lot about what happens where you don't have policies in the country that protect indigenous rights to indigenous people's rights to their land, but instead create a conflict between logging companies, as was said by Julia, who will log in areas that may not have been yet recognized by the government in terms of being indigenous rights, and still within a struggle to achieve those rights, warring with loggers who are coming into areas that have been so-called opened up by the government. And it's very interesting when you look back to the name of this session. It's about the Lorax, which is a cautionary tale about what happens when you have unfettered ambition to create the production, upon an area and people who are totally ingrained with the land. The land is part of them and their community, and that ambition leads to the destruction of the people in the story of the Lorax. And you see the same thing happening, unfortunately, in Peru. And I think just going into, how do we look at this issue, and what are the priority areas that need to be thought of in terms of reform to ensure that defenders are not killed and attacked for their work to defend the forest. I do think that, one of the first things we have to look at is how do we really protect indigenous peoples, environmental and land defenders? How do we strengthen the national laws and policies that do that? The passage of the ratification of the Escazú Agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean is an important milestone and achievement in terms of a legally binding treaty, which has a provision that speaks about the importance of protection of environmental defenders and environmental human rights defenders. And unfortunately, Peru had not gone ahead and agreed to the ratification of the Escazú Agreement. So I would put that as a really big priority in the region to try and address illegal logging. It's not just a convention about rights to information or participation. It's also about protecting environmental human rights defenders and access to justice. And so that to me would be a real priority looking forward. Secondly, I do think—
And sorry, Carol, to come in just like 40 seconds. Let's put it that way, even less than a minute.
Then very quickly, I would say other two priorities are about securing land tenure for Indigenous peoples and ensuring that the priority is not given to just think about enforcement in terms of having more wardens in the forest, but ensuring that Indigenous peoples can manage their land and that they get the support from the state in managing those lands, and action is taken jointly. And then lastly, of course, supporting community managed forests so that it's a joint government and people way of managing forests in the future. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You've given us very detailed recommendations outside on your priorities. What I'd like to do now is to revert back to the other speakers and ask them for some maybe, one dot point or 2 dot points of what they will be doing in terms of more detailed recommendations. And perhaps obviously as the last speaker, I'll come back to you and say, would you have anything, other points from above what you've already said to add to what the other speakers say? Thank you again. Francisco, could I come back to you with a question? You have highlighted, obviously, the importance of Indigenous people, their plight as well. And as from your position of an organization that has worked now for so long, like the Forest Stewardship Council, to protect forest and Indigenous people, if you were the minister, I think you're speaking from Panama, if you are the Minister for Environment or even maybe the Interior involved in law enforcement, what would be the first thing that you'd like to change in, say, Panama or even other countries in Central America, for instance, something that you could say, this is a very practical, fundamental thing that we need to change?
So the key element for Indigenous people, when we think in terms of the way how they want to manage their territory, is the right? That's the first step. But the rights is not so simple because, for instance, in Brazil, as my colleague Daniel and Julia and Caroline mentioned, the Indigenous people there, they have the constitutional right. Right now, they face several challenge to guarantee their rights. But that would be the first step. At the second moment, we need to connect the legal framework. If you talk in terms of the constitutional rights, we need to connect the legal framework, guarantee the rights of the Indigenous people with the market. Because the market will be the way for influence, in fact, the business sectors to ensure that they are going to follow the law, because if not, they are going to have some implication in terms of the demand. The third step would be to create, as Julia mentioned, important element in terms of the transparency, accountability, and also in terms of the enforcement, as Daniel mentioned different moments. From me, also, I would add the importance of having a strong and effective monitoring system, because through the monitoring system, we can have the base, for instance, to protect the life of the Indigenous people, to identify the company associated with crimes, for instance, and then we can use that information to protect the lives of the different organizations. But at the same time, we can connect the monitoring system to promote responsible business. So I would say we should connect these 3 pillars: the legal framework, the market, the enforcement, transparency, monitoring, as the key elements to, in fact, start to think in terms of the possible solution to transform the challenge that we just discussed during this panel.
Thank you, Francisco. And you mentioned that the issue that Julia also addressed, the question about corruption and transparency, accountability. So perhaps I would like to go back to Julia and And again, from your perspective, based in Peru, I mean, we know that I think corruption is a huge problem across many different countries. In fact, it's one of my current, I should say, research interests. And last year, I did a review paper that looked at corruption, not only in the forest sector, but also in agriculture, fisheries, irrigation, mining. And everywhere I looked, there is significant corruption. So it's a really systemic problem. And now, from your perspective, from working with the Environmental Investigation Agency, what is that? You mentioned transparency, but that is a general thing that maybe it's a general statement. Is there something else that you could say, from your experience, that could work in Peru to try to address this significant problem that corruption that affects forests?
Yeah, I mean that's that's the challenge, right? And I think that it's a combination of law enforcement in the country, but also demands and pressure from international cooperation coming for the forest, and also from international demand. And I think that in a everyday, more globalized world, that's what we need to look for, right? We need to look for these points where we can help each other. So as I was saying, we can all be accomplices of these human rights violations and assassinations if we're not really taking our steps in making sure that what we buy, what we're demanding, is actually clean. In Peru, what has been happening is that the industry, first, the estimation of illegal logging in Peru, I mean, we estimate that it's about 80% of all the timber that moves in the country has an illegal origin, right? So it's the vast majority. And there's an interest from the industry to keep it blurry, right? To not being able to differentiate what's clean and what's not. And they have been lobbying against transparency. So they have been lobbying to diminish the legal standards in the country. And and then what we have found as an ally has been the international markets and the international demand. Even though the timber that Peru exports is minimum in comparison with what stays in the country, it has been important. So it's that's part of the thing. I mean, first, transparency, insistent transparency. Nobody should buy anything that they don't know where it's coming from. The technology is there to help. I mean, it can be done. And then the other thing is that start investigating the things as organized crime, right? Because if we look at at illegal deforestation or illegal logging as environmental crimes, normally the sanctions for environmental crimes are very, very low. And even the prosecutors don't care that much. They're like, come on, a few trees. We have a huge Amazon here. Who cares about that? Some people are getting jobs. So what we need to understand is what's the real impact. And I think that we're moving forward in that direction worldwide. I mean, people are understanding better and better what's the impact of illegal deforestation. And understanding that it's not just one guy with a chainsaw that is trying to buy food for their kids. This is an organized international crime that is behind this. And so that's one line of investigation. And the other line is human rights abuses, right? What Daniel was saying about indigenous communities having to take the responsibility themselves to protect their forest. That's happening here too. And it's understandable that people want to protect their forest the same way that you would protect your house, but it's not fair. It's not fair that they have been left alone to protect something that is not only giving services to them, but it's giving services to the whole humanity. So, I think that those are the two lines of work where we need to keep going. Escazú agreement was rejected in Peru because people said that there was a strong opposition from the industry. They were arguing that it was going to make Peru lose sovereignty over their forests, which is a lie, but they had a strong campaign. And also the other argument was like, we already have all those laws. What do we have to sign something else, right? And but we all understand that it's very important. It's a clear sign, but it's also very important to take everything we can to protect environmental defender rights.
Thank you, Julia. And as you mentioned, Daniel obviously raised similar issues related, and I'd like to go back to Daniel. And Daniel, you did mention that in the last part of your sort of introductory remarks that, one thing that you saw as very important is, the role of NGOs and the international community in putting pressure on the Bolsonaro government. Now, in the US, where you're based, you have now an administration which is certainly much more environmentally oriented, with obviously made big commitments on climate change. So I assume that deforestation, illegal logging should come back at the top of their agenda. What would you tell President Biden to do to address this problem that if he's so committed to addressing the issue of climate change and the deforestation as well? How can the US impact more on Brazil, and what should Biden tell, for instance, the EU? What could they do together?
Sure. Well, yeah, you're right that there's a complete change in government in the US, and President Biden has very publicly said not only is climate a priority, but one of the examples he's held up as a candidate repeatedly was the Amazon rainforest. Now, the reaction from Bolsonaro was pretty much, go like, we don't want your help, very nationalistic. The first message is for any international leader, for Washington now, but also European leaders who've gotten involved, is keep in mind that Brazil is not just Bolsonaro. Just like in any of these countries, it's not just the whoever's the head of state. It's very important where there's concern to be reaching out with the many other actors, the many other allies that exist, subnational, governments, certain parts of the private sector who, as Julia said, actually want to do the right thing. It's in their business interest to do the right thing. They don't want the unfair competition. And as we keep coming back to the people who actually live in the rainforest, especially indigenous communities, who are key actors, and there should be a greater effort to reach out to them to sort of prevent this kind of, nationalism used as a demagogic way for certain elites to not deal with this problem. I want to go sort of big picture here, though, because all the other panelists have put out a lot of really good and important ideas, different angles of this problem. And, we talked earlier about people having worked on this for many decades. And a lot of these ideas have been around for a while. And we haven't seen the sort of progress we want, not because they're not good ideas, but just because the obstacles were so daunting. But I think we are entering a new era in the context of the climate crisis, right? Luca, you mentioned in terms of Biden, it's linked to his climate policy. But for everyone, it's linked to that. And the climate crisis, of course, the stakes are so much higher. That's the bad news. The good news, though, is that there's a much bigger awareness that what happens in the Amazon, in South America, and other rainforests around the world has consequences for the entire globe. It really is everyone's problem. So the degree of concern, international concern among governments, but also among their constituencies, is that much greater. And so I do think that it is possible to generate not only more concern, but more pressure that can be effective, that can give new life to some of the ideas that have been put out there, and the efforts to make sure that the local actors, indigenous communities, and others have the support they need. Because now it is a climate crisis. It's not just in Washington and London and elsewhere that they're concerned about biodiversity. Not that these aren't enough of a reason, but it affects everyone. And I think particularly the potential for, one of the areas Julia has emphasized, the demand side, and really trying to tap into the concern among consumers who are buying products not just wood, but all the other products that are commodities that are associated with deforestation are made aware of what their commodities are linked to. And that stronger regulations like the Lacey Act, but even better ones are put in place. And there's real momentum there in Europe, in the UK, in the United States to have stronger legislation regulating supply chains, requiring due diligence. And in fact, just this week, Human Rights Watch joined with the Environmental Investigative Agency in supporting, along with many other civil society groups, a new legislation in the United States that would require companies to make sure the supply chains for other commodities, not just wood, are in fact not contributing to deforestation. So these problems have been around for a while. They're really good ideas that have been around for a while, but I'm hopeful that in the context of this climate crisis that gives us reason to be pessimistic, it also gives us reason to be optimistic that we can get more traction than maybe we've ever done before.
Thank you, Daniel. Let me go back to Carol now. We just have a couple of minutes left, really, Carol, in our session. And while we were sort of the various speakers were looking, putting their points forward, and one of the things that came through was this need, obviously, to enforce the law, to put pressure on governments, and so on. And as I was thinking about the many questions I wanted to ask you, one thing that sort of struck me was your title there, in terms of the Director of Environmental Democracy Practice at the WRI. And so actually there is one thing that I'd like to ask you, which is, from my experience, I'm still doing some work at the moment on Indonesia, on law enforcement related to fires. What I see quite often is basically law enforcement is certainly required, but there is a risk that the law is enforced against, again, yet the local people, to make them the scapegoats for fires or for illegal logging. So one question for you, I don't want to put you on the spot because I know that is probably not expected, but from your perspective of environmental democracy practice, what do we need to think about if we say we need to have stronger law enforcement, but how do we protect local people from, even harder implementation that goes in the end against them of law enforcement?
So in our practice, why we work on environmental democracy is we believe that people have the right to have a say in the environment, that environmental information needs to be transparent, that people have a right to participate in decisions that affect them, and that there has to be a mechanism to have access to justice, a remedy or redress where they're harmed. And so we focus on those principles because we think without that, people feel removed and are removed from decisions that relate to what they're doing in their life and how they're using natural resources, both to preserve natural resources for the environmental sake, but also for their livelihoods and for their benefits and what nature gives to us all. So unfortunately, what we've seen is that many people feel, they're not connected to environmental decision making because they're very far removed for it. And while I love the optimism from Danielle, why we work on these rights is without people really having a say. So people in Peru and people in Brazil really caring about these issues and really having a right to participate and say what they think can happen. Then you have issues like, law enforcement enforcing against, the wrong set of people who are not causing a big problem, but maybe using a resource in, a traditional way that they've always done that doesn't really have as big an impact as a decision to allow, a huge development that will cut down, 3 times the amount of resources and what, is a traditional use of a specific natural resource like, forests. So, to me, the solutions, I agree, a lot of these solutions have been there for a long time, but I think unless we get to those root causes of ensuring that we feel as people that we have a say in what happens in our country and that these rights are there that we can enforce, I don't think that we'll make as much progress. So I think the politics really matter about how much people power is real in a country going forward. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. Now, unfortunately, we have run out of time on our session. I wish we had another hour for discussion, but I guess then I would invite everyone to join again. I mentioned continuing the conversation room, and definitely look forward to that discussion. And of course, thank you very much to the conference organizer for having us all, the panelists and myself, in this very interesting conversation. Thank you.